Hello and welcome to Library Drawing Party. Today we're going to be drawing this beautiful park scene. To get started, we're going to work from light to dark. So one of the lightest pieces of our drawing is the stone wall. So I'm going to mix this color. I'm going to put some brown, some yellow, and a bit of black, because we want this sandy gray color. Put in a little bit more yellow. So this is the color that I mixed in my rainbow watercolor set. And since I want the color to be fairly light, I'm going to add a lot of water to the pigment. Then I'm going to paint my wall. And this is also just to give us an idea of where we want things to go. So we have a corner here, and I'm drawing a cornerstone for decoration above it. And then I'm going to use the same color for our tree, which has a lot of gray tones in it. And we have this branch coming out of the trunk. And then there's some roots. Then I'm going to use that color to start putting down the forest floor, although we're going to be layering a lot of colors on the forest floor, so you don't need to cover it completely. We just want to get some color down. And then in the background, you can see there's a peninsula. So I'm going to use some of that gray to start establishing the peninsula. And also the tree line. So I'm just going to do some dashes for tree line, which will also be our horizon line. And we're going to be layering color on top of this. So once we have our basic outline established, then let's add some brown to that same color that we used for the stone wall, so we can work on the tree trunk. So you can see it's still got that sandy tone to it, but now it has a bit more brown. So I'm going to use that for my tree trunk. I'm going to add in some roots. And we want to see the texture, so it's good to see some of the brush strokes. You want your brush to be fairly dry for this. And then while my brush is wet, I'm going to stipple or make dabs on the forest floor. Give it some texture and some color. I'm going to do some for inside the stone wall too. And let's put a little color in our tree line in the background. Maybe a bit more here. I'm going to add in a bit of shading because our light source is coming this way. Now let's take some orange, because we want this to be fall, early winter. And I'm gonna just dab here. And this will be the leaves that are gathering underneath our trees. And let's put some orange in our stone wall. It's okay if the leaves start to drip a bit, because then they'll just keep going into the forest floor. You can even add some over here. And I'm going to add some orange to our tree line and horizon line. This will be a nice contrast to the blue of the lake and the blue of the sky. You can even add in a bit of orange into our tree if you want to draw some lines. Now for a bit of texture, I'm going to take my tissue and blot some of the forest floor together. And this will add some subtle texture. And since I'm using watercolor pencils, I'm going to work while the tree is still wet, but if you have regular color pencils at home, you're going to want to wait until your watercolor has dried. I'm going to add in some lines for the tree trunk. This will help give it that nice rough texture that we're going for. I'm using a sandy brown right now. And you want it to be especially highlighted on this side, because that's where our light source is coming from. I'm going to take a darker brown and use that for mid-tones and the roots. And by using these pencils while the paint is still wet, the color will expand a little bit. I'm going to take my black. I'm going to draw some shadow on the side and underneath the main branch. And then up along the roots. And since we're going for a rough texture, we can use some rough pencil strokes. But you can also blend it in with water if you're using the watercolor pencil. And if you're using colored pencils, you can also use your eraser to blend it in a bit. I'm going to add in some more of that gray color for our shadow. While I have the gray color on my brush, I'm going to use it for our stone wall. This will help give it a bit more dimension. I'm doing the inside and a little bit of the outside with this. It's just slightly darker gray. I'm going to use my brown to start adding in the blocks. So we have two planes here. There's the top of the stone and then there's the side of the stone. So we want the top of the stone to be horizontal lines. In this case, we want it to be slightly diagonal lines. And then we want to make a right angle for the sides with vertical lines. And no stone is going to be exactly the same, so we don't need to worry about these lines being very straight. It'll help show the age of the stone if there's a bit of curve in them. And then there's the stone for decoration in the corner. Once you have your cubes established, you can take some of the brown gray that we used for our tree trunk and add in some texture. You want your brush to be pretty dry for this because we're going to be using that stippling technique where we add some texture by adding some dots. We want this to make it almost like polka dots. You can add in a bit more gray near the corners. I'm going to use a slightly darker gray here for the inside of the wall. Okay, now at this point, let's work on the blue. So I'm just going to be using the blue from my rainbow watercolor set for the sky. And it's okay if it bleeds into the tree line a little bit, it will just be like the branches at the top of the trees. And before we work on our lake, let's take that sandy color and I'm going to draw in a rough outline of the building. So we can see some of the roof and some of the columns. And this is in the distance, so we don't need a lot of details here. We just want to see that there's a building out on our peninsula. And I'm going to actually use the green first before I do the rest of the lake color. Add in some grass to our peninsula since it's closer to the water. A little bit greener. We don't want this to be too green though, because it is supposed to be a fall or winter scene. That way we hint at the green. And then let's take our blue and fill in our lake. And we're going to paint the trees on top of this after this dries. So we don't have to worry about the trees just yet. You could also use a smaller brush for this. I like the thicker brush because then I can just use the side of my brush for these details. But I can also cover a lot of area quickly, which helps get that nice even color but whatever you're more comfortable with. I'm going to add in a bit more blue to our sky. In my sample drawing, I also went from dark to light in the sky, so you can do that as well. You would just make sure you have more pigment on top, but I'm liking having it more of a clear blue day, so I'm going to leave it. I might do a bit of extra water by the tree line, though. And I'm going to actually take some gray, add in some texture to the lake, and I'll take a bit more blue. This will act like waves. It's a calm day, but there's always going to be movement on the water. And then I'm going to actually add in a bit of blue to our forest floor. Keep it from being too one-dimensional. I'm going to add in a bit of green too. Perhaps there's moss by the roots. Or along the stone wall. And you can take your tissue to blot it in. Now at this point I'm going to use my black, and I'm going to make a dark gray. So I'm going to just take some black and put it in one of the compartments and add a lot of water to it. That way it would be a little bit gray for our shadow. And since our light source is coming here, there's going to be a lot of shadow behind the stone wall. So I'm going to add that in now. There's going to be shadow inside as well. But we want to make sure we leave some of that orange so we can see the leaves that we added initially. And there's even going to be a bit of shadow on this side of the stone wall because it is outdoors, so our light is coming from many different directions. Our primary light is coming this way, but there is going to be reflected light coming from other places too. Add in some gray to the forest floor and use our tissue to blot it in. I'm going to add in a bit more shadow here. So this is looking a bit light. And I'm going to add in a shrub that is mostly black. You can also use a black watercolor pencil for this. And you can add in a bit of green. Give me like an evergreen kind of shrub. Use my tissue, blend it in with the background a bit more. And then that same gray I'm going to use for our trees in the background. So these are just going to be vertical lines coming down into the orange leaves that we established in the beginning of our drawing. And there's going to be thicker pieces and thinner ones. Might be a good idea to use a thin brush for this so that you can get nice and thin lines. I'm going to switch to my thin brush. And you want your brush to be pretty wet because we want this to be nice and fluid. I'm going to add in some branches. These are just going to be diagonal lines connecting to the trunk. Let me use some brown for the trunks. So I'll give them another dimension. And I'm going to use some of that brown gray from our tree trunk for the branches. We want to make sure we can still see the background, that this doesn't become so crowded that we can't see our peninsula. And I'm going to use my watercolor pencil, the black, to add in some shading and to help reestablish the tree trunks. And I'm going to add in some very thin branches coming off of the trunks. And you want this to be pretty organic. So you move the pencil where it feels best. I'm going to add in a bit more shading here too with our black. And I'm going to use some stippling with our pencil. You can see this is making the dots. And giving us some more texture. I'm going to use the sandy color too. I'm going to add in just some sandy color highlights in the top. And I'm going to add in a bit of orange highlights for our leaves with my watercolor pencil. And there you have it. That's our park scene. Thank you for joining us in this week's library drawing party. We have library drawing parties every Wednesday at 7 p.m. and keep being creative.